It's nice to be able to come up here every once in a while. It's still kind of crazy to me how many times I've given a message up here, but yet I still get nervous about everything, and now my podium's on the other side of the stage, so we are definitely creatures of habit, and we like to keep things the same, and that's kind of what my message is about today. It's about change in this world, change in our lives, the change in us, and how kind of we cope with that change. I'm going to start out with a song by Bernard Ingram, and it says in the chorus, "Everything must change, nothing stays the same. Everyone must change, no one stays the same. The young become old, and the mysteries unfold, because that's the way of time. Nothing and no one goes unchanged. Winter turns to spring, wounded hearts will heal, but never much too soon. Yes, everything must change." The Greek philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus stated, "Everything is in motion and doesn't stay the same. You cannot step in the same river twice." That statement brings me back to even when I was a kid, and we would go to Glendive, Montana to visit my grandparents. And my grandma and Grandpa Kuntz lived on a large lot, couple, 3-4 acres, right next to the Yellowstone River. And of course, me being young and always being a fisherman, I always wanted to go to the river to go fishing. But my grandmother and my mom and dad would always tell me that I wasn't allowed to go to the river by myself because the river was swift, there was lots of undertows, and the banks would erode, and then underneath the river, the floor of the river was ever changing. And I never could understand what she was talking about until I got older and I started fishing the Yellowstone River with my grandfather. And there were times in the Yellowstone River that you stepped in one day and the water was only up to your knees, and you step into the same spot 2 days later and it was 6 foot deep, because the undertows would take all of that sediment and pick it up and move it downriver. Just crazy how nature happens and how things change all the time. Our lives are a lot like that river. They're always changing. I know we wish things could stay the same, and I'm not telling you really anything that most of you don't already know. Today's topic is coping with change, and I hope that we can share some wisdom amongst ourselves about ways in which we can stay afloat in the river that it's always moving. How we manage in the world that is ever changing. I think there's several kinds of change in each one of our lives, and I think the first one starts with the way we change. From the moment we are born, we are changing. In the mother's womb, we see cells that split and multiply. And soon, there are so many cells that begin to form a head and a face and a body and fingers and toes. Once we're born, the change keeps coming. Our minds grow and they develop, and we learn new skills. Our bodies grow and develop and age. And I think each and every one of us know about that aging of our bodies. We're quite aware of what things can do, or what time can change and do to our bodies. Sometimes it's the change in our lives with how we see things. Sometimes there's times in our lives where we're stronger than we've ever been. And then we find later in life that sometimes we are weaker. We see that our skills change. We learn new things that our mind is ever developing, especially when we're young and we're just soaking it up like a sponge. And then we find later on in life that things begin to diminish. And sometimes our mind are not as sharp. Sometimes our hearing is not as good. And sometimes we can't remember things that we used to be able to remember. I know each and every one of us have found times where you walk into a room looking for something and then you can't remember what you're looking for. I do that on a daily basis still. We change and our bodies and our minds bear the effects of time. Along with the change of our physical bodies and our minds, so to speak, comes this change in personal circumstances. In our lives, we find that maybe we get a new job, or maybe we lose a job, or we are laid off. Maybe we retire. Maybe there's times in life where the school year ends, or maybe you're graduating from high school or college. Those things are ever changing in our lives, and it's our circumstances that sometimes bear that change along with our personal change. There are times in our life where we have just the right amount of money, or maybe we even have more than maybe we think we should even have. And then there's other times that we spend hours on paper trying to figure out how we're going to make it to the next week, living paycheck to paycheck. Sometimes we're happy and everything is going great, and other times things are not so great, and we worry about all the change that is happening around us. Our circumstances do change. And then there are the people around us who change. We find that sometimes friends that we've had for 20, 30, 40 years that have always been around sometimes aren't always there. And then other times we have friendships that last maybe only 6 months to a year because circumstances change in that person's life or in your life. Sometimes we fade apart. Then we see the physical change in our friends, where we look around and we can see that our spouse, that our parents, that other people around us are changing and they're growing older. And we wish so much that things would just stay the same. We lose people in our lives. They pass before us. I know for me, just looking around this church, I miss so many people with where they used to sit. Bob Clare used to sit right in the second pew all the time. Bob Clare was a mentor of mine. I remember the first time that I was asked to be an elder, I was like, I'm not old enough. I'm not wise enough. There's no way that I could be a spiritual leader. And Bob Clare took me under his wing. And every time I got to this communion table, whether I was babbling about whatever it was, thinking I had just messed up horribly, Bob Clare would come to me in between services and say, would you please come bring that same message to the second service, because I enjoyed it so much. He encouraged me all the time. He was an amazing man. And then I look around and I'm missing Ione sitting back here. Ione and I had a love-hate relationship. And I think many of you probably stood in that same place. Ione, though, had a soft side to her. And I know when she was head of worship and I was doing lots of weddings and a few funerals, that she was always there to pick me up, to tell me it was going to be okay. Those times where I was out back, pacing back and forth, nervous as all get out, she would be the one that came to me and said, it's going to be okay. Everything will go fine. It'll go the way God wants it to go. We brought up Fern Johnson. I miss her so much sitting there. What a beautiful woman she is. And we all see the change in her too. And it's hard. It's hard to lose those around us and to see that change in them. To see Fern, who was just an amazing woman that was always supportive. The first one that always gave you a hug when you walked in the front door. And now we don't have her here with us. I miss her on Sunday mornings. Just like I miss several people that have gone before us. Those changes are tough. Those same changes happen in our families, where we see our mother and our father growing older, not knowing exactly what's going to happen to them. hoping that God takes them in a way which is peaceful. Society changes, our culture changes. We call it progress. Do we call it evolution? Do we call it de-evolution? In my lifetime, we've gone from a modern age to the postmodern age. We've experienced increase in civil rights for women and blacks and gays and lesbians, along with vicious terrorism in the name of religion. We've fought 3 large wars and countless small invasions, bombing, interventions. We've seen records of vinyl go to cassette or go to 8-track, then go to cassette. And this is just in my lifetime. Go to cassette that went to CDs that now it's MP3 players and your cell phones. Nobody carries cameras anymore on vacations because everything is on that cell phone. It's crazy how much things have changed. Even in the cell phone world, how much things have changed. I remember the very first phone was the brick phone. And they called it just that because it was the size of a brick. I remember the first time I ever made a call on a cell phone. I was actually in Glendive, Montana, and I was living with my uncle, or working for my uncle in Glendive, and I hauled fuel for farmers. I would load up the bulk tank, I would take it out to their farms, and I'd fill up their big gravity-fed gas tanks. Most of my stops were 50 to 100 miles away from where our shop was, so my uncle would always throw the cell phone in the truck to make sure that if I had any issues, I'd be able to make that phone call to him. Well, one day, being the young kid I was, I decided to make a phone call, but it wasn't to him. I made a phone call to then my girlfriend. I just wanted to let her know that I was heading down the Bloomfield Highway and that I was heading home and that I would be home in time to go on our date. Then I got the bill. I was making about $15 an hour, and let's just say that cell phone bill that I had to pay to my uncle was 2 days' wages. Crazy how much cell phones used to cost to make a phone call. We all remember technology. I mean, I remember back when I was in grade school and there was no such thing as a computer, and then the Commodore 64 came along. And you had to learn how to type in stuff correctly in order to get a program to run. And now on our cell phones, we have more data in one of our cell phones than they did on the rocket ship to the moon the very first time. Technology is ever changing, and there's no way we could ever keep up unless you have more money than I have. It would be impossible. It all demands our response. It's tiring, it's overwhelming. It's no wonder that we have difficulties coping with change. How do you cope with change? How do you deal with it? I'm going to bring up just a few ways in which I've seen people deal with change in my life. The first being ignoring change, which is exactly what I like to do. Some of us deny that change ever took place, or we cope with it by ignoring it. We seem to forget that our children are growing adults, and somehow we want to still tell them what to do in their lives and how to live it. We look at our grandchildren's growing up, and we think, what the heck happened to this generation? And I think that happens for every generation to come. Or when we do acknowledge that we've been feeling this pain, this change in our lives, we begin to deny it, and sometimes we deny even obvious things that are right in front of our face. We deny the fact that maybe our parents or our spouse are addicts, or maybe they're just workaholics. And instead of confronting them, we tend to ignore it. We just want to face that something's different for us. We want to call upon the response to a situation that we may not totally understand. So we retreat in silence to that attitude of business as usual. But there's a cost for that because we cannot stop change. It will forever be in front of us. And even if we ignore it, it still comes. A lot of us not so much deny it, but we actually fight change. We stand against it. We fight against uncertainty. And anger is sometimes our first response. We resent having to accommodate to different things. We fear that we might lose something. We can't imagine that change would bring an improvement. Therefore, we conclude that it will always be the worst. Sometimes we become depressed, or change brings us grief. Or we feel overwhelmed and not up to the challenge of accommodating the change. Sometimes we have an excessive reverence for something that now is going to change. And we think to ourselves, that's not the way we do things. We want things to stay the same, the way they've always been. We get materialized in certain things in our lives, and when they change, it upsets us. And that's okay. It's okay to be angry, and it's okay to feel an attachment to an item that has been in your life forever, as long as you can remember. But to know that those feelings are valid and that you're able to feel that way, but to know that change is still going to happen. And sometimes it's the change in our attitude that helps us to cope with that change. There's a story that I read on the internet that kind of caught me in a way in which we look at things and sometimes we don't want change because we want things to stay the same because we're not sure exactly why, but it's something that's just been a constant in our lives and we don't want it to change. In the book, Minding Your Own Business, Murray Raphael tells this story. Years ago, a Russian czar came upon a lonely sentry standing unattended in a scheduled corner of a garden place. He asked him, "What are you doing? What are you guarding?" And the czar said, "I don't know. The captain ordered me to post here, so that's where I'm at." The czar called the captain over and he asked him, he said, there was written regulations specifying guard was to assist this area. And the czar ordered to find out why. So he went back in the archive books and revealed that Catherine the Great had planted a rose bush in this corner and ordered a sentry to protect it for that evening. And 100 years later, they were still protecting a barren spot where a rose never even stood for over 100 years. Sometimes in change, we have to look at the circumstances and why it is that we have something in our lives. Do we really need it? There might have been a purpose at that time for it, but maybe that purpose has moved on. And now it's time to move in a different direction and find different things that we can reflect upon that maybe brings us closer to God. I know for some, and I would say this might describe my wife, she wants to control change. Imagine that. We mitigate change by controlling everyone and everything in our path. And that's not my wife. She doesn't control me that much. By our overwhelming micromanaging, by just being sometimes plain bossy. If I can direct, I really didn't mean that way at all. Now I'm feeling bad. She's not quite that bad. She likes to control things, but maybe not that much. And if that doesn't work, I can always turn around and I can blame myself for the changes that did occur. Because if I can figure out what I did wrong, I can avoid the next time. So in a way, I can control change. If I only had said or done something differently, then this wouldn't have happened. If only I had been there, she wouldn't have gotten sick. If only, this illusion that we can neither block change nor control it all the time. For change will come, whether we want it to or not. And often is more powerful than we are. It's impossible to control change. I don't know anyone who is able to take change completely in stride. There are many complex feelings, behaviors associated with change. It's unsettling. And it pulls us out of our haven of security and presents us with something different. It takes away our illusion that we can predict the future. It takes away this illusion of control. It means we lose that which we have known forever. Whether we hate the status quo or just deeply frightened of it, or maybe it just brings anxiety to us. Maybe we're just not up to the task and we don't feel like handling that change. Change brings us loss, just as often as it brings us gain. We reflect on all these feelings, and the way we react to change is different for each and every one of us. So, how are we supposed to cope with change? How does God expect us to cope with change? We know that God does not change, but He made this world, He made each and every one of us, and He knows the way He created us in this world that there will be change. In Isaiah 43:19, He says, "See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I make a way in the wilderness and the streams and the wasteland." God knows there is change around us. And how do we cope with it? I know for me, I have to be aware of my jerking knee. Because a lot of the times I have a knee-jerk response to change. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed, and because I feel overwhelmed, I just want to push change away. It's an automatic response in a way. I know that this is my fear speaking, and while it's important to acknowledge my fear, I don't want to do what it says just because I'm afraid I'm going to be overwhelmed by something that's changing, and I don't like to be overwhelmed. I can usually find ways to rearrange my time and my schedule so I don't feel as overwhelmed, but yet that change is still there. But sometimes I look back and I have to think about, I really have to honor change, and I have to honor the loss of something that was very important in my life. It's kind of bittersweet in a way. And sometimes I have to grieve, and sometimes I have to rage over what that change was in my life. I know one thing that I lost and might not be perceived as that important, but it was baseball. When I was younger, I played baseball quite well. I loved it. It was my game. I was never a big kid, so I could never play football. So when I got to high school, it was all about baseball. I could not wait till spring training started and to go out there with my friends and just throw that ball around. I played shortstop and I played second base, and it was my absolute favorite thing to do. I lived my glory years for many years afterwards, telling it to everybody about, hey, this is what we did, whether it was summer Legion ball or if it was playing with the school. It was something I always enjoyed. A few years ago, I decided to join a softball league. And I remember at the very first practice, I was playing second base, and I got a hard hit ball right to me. I fielded it fine, but I had to dodge to my left, and I was going to make a double play. So when I dodged to the left, I grabbed the ball, and I tried to do a Derek Jeter and jump up in the air and spin and throw it to second base. It didn't look like Derek Jeter at all. I remember a pop in my shoulder, and my shoulder just was sore for a long time afterwards. It was an injury that I actually received when I was playing baseball in high school, and it flared up. And all of a sudden, I had a hard time throwing from second base to first base. I was not the ball player that I used to be because of my age, maybe a little bit of extra weight. I just was not that ball player anymore. And to a certain extent, I had to back off. And to me, that hurt because it was something I loved so much. And I know it's menial in many people's lives, but it was something that was very important to me. And I miss it. I miss it tremendously. I lived it through my daughter's softball for a while. I still watch games on TV every day. I would love to get into umpiring someday. I did a little bit when I was younger, but I feel maybe it's something that I could do again. It's a way that I can still enjoy the game, but it's changed. I'm no longer that person that I used to be. We have to deal with it in different ways, and things change in our lives all the time. But now, thinking about it, knowing that I can still be involved in the game, maybe not the way I used to be, it's a time to celebrate. Something to look forward to. In 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, it says, "Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and the momentary troubles are achieved for us an eternal glory that far outweigh them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is unseen is temporary, but what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." I think coping with change takes practice. It isn't something we do once and then master it. Rather, it's something we are called to do over and over and over again, sometimes with mixed results. The greater the change, the harder the practice. Yet the better we cope, the more free we feel. How helpful is it to deny or fight a reality that's already there? Or to overly clutter our lives with attempts to control everything and everyone? We can get so caught up in the resistance that we leave the present moment, the current newness of our lives. And since this moment is all that we have, really, what is our life if we can't accept it? Change is hard, yes, and it brings loss. It brings sorrow. It's an interruption in our lives, but it's also the way in which we grow, in a way in which God can use us for His good. It's a way in which we can help keep His commandments. Change per se is neither good nor bad. It's kind of what we make of it. It's that attitude adjustment that we have to have in our lives. When change brings forward, yes, take hold. Make sure that we are acknowledging that loss and that hurt. And yes, sometimes even that anger. But the change is forever moving, and it will be in our lives. It's part of our lives. The question is, what are we going to do with it? How are we willing to live with it? Everything must change. Nothing stays the same. Everyone must change. No one stays the same. The young become old and the mysteries unfold, because that's the way of time. Nothing and no one goes unchanged. In the beginning, our changes may be wise, may be courageous, maybe we be open to the change in our lives. If we must know its bitterness, may we also know its sweetness. Everything must change. Amen.